Hey guys, it is Dungeon Master Mark. Just want to do a real quick updated video on how-to for casting plaster molds. So for this particular video, we're going to be using one of the 4-Bot molds from 4-Bot Industries by Jason Bott. This is one of the newer cavern molds. You guys can see some of the detail there. And of course, the last video I did has been quite a while ago, so I just want to do an updated video for some of the people who are a little bit newer to casting or who don't feel comfortable whether or not they can do it themselves. I've taught many classes on mold casting. I've done them at a convention. I've done them for my couple of local stores. So it is extremely easy, and I'm going to show you guys a step-by-step how to basically go from the mold, the plaster and water to having paintable cast. Something you can paint like that. So this is 4 different tiles that's been cast. And then obviously painted, clear-coated, dry, and everything else. So yeah. So I'm going to show you guys how to do it. First thing you want to do is you probably want to get something to cover your table. I have a casting table downstairs just for the purpose of casting. But this is just some kind of cheap wax paper. You can get it at your local dollar store. Something similar. Very easy. You're going to need something to mix your plaster with. So for this, we're just going to use some cheap dollar store little sticks, like popsicle sticks. Something to scrape your mold with. So this is where you're going to get off the excess plaster. This is just a little cheap plastic, kind of like a squeegee used for kneading bread and cutting up bread, where you're using dough. I believe it's called a dough knife, I believe. But you can also use kind of like the little squeegee used for windows and things like that. This is just something I picked up maybe like 50 cents. I picked up a couple at a time, and this has lasted me a couple years. So very cheap, lasts a long time. Then the next biggest thing you're going to need, of course, is your mold, or if you've made your own mold. For this purpose, again, we're using one of the 4-Bot Industries molds. And then you're going to need a couple different cups. Here we have our plaster, which I'll go over plaster here in a second. An empty cup for actually mixing things, and then water. Ideally, you want distilled water, or you want room temperature water. If you left out a little bit, you don't want any soda or anything like that you mix, because you can cause some different chemical reactions. So you want to be extremely careful as to what you're mixing if you have put anything else in your water. So that's pretty much for it. And then back to plaster. There are hundreds of different types of plaster itself, ranging from plaster of Paris, which is about 1,000 psi, like tensile strength, all the way up to some of the tough stones, some of the much harder, what's called dental stones. This is what's called hydrostone. So this is about 10,000 psi. So that's how much pressure you can put on it, basically pressure per square inch. So this is a fairly, I don't want to say middle, it's a little bit higher in the tensile strength than some of your normal plasters. But it takes paint very well. And it's going to be a little harder to break and to chip than some of the other plasters. So I'm going to do a future video comparing some of the different types of plasters out there. So definitely stay tuned for that. But for this, we're just using what's called hydrostone. You can also find something similar, which is called Hydro Cow, at some of your local craft stores like Hobby Lobby and Michael's. It's a little bit not quite as strong as this, but it's still a fairly good medium for something if you're brand new casting. So the first thing we're going to do when we're going to be casting our plaster, let's go ahead and move the mold back just a little bit here. We're going to need to mix our plaster with water. So ideally, you're going to have about twice as much plaster as you do water. Depending on your plaster, say some plasters require more water and some require more plaster, just depending on the make of the actual plaster itself. And let me see if I can zoom in just a little bit here. Now, when you do pour plaster into water, it is an exothermic effect. So it does cause a chemical reaction, which means it does put out a little bit of heat. So ideally, you probably don't want to use foam in case you do use a plaster that puts out a lot of heat, because you don't want to melt it to then make a big giant mess over your table. Of course, this is where the wax paper comes in handy, because you don't want to mess up your table and then have your wife hate you, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and add a little bit of plaster. Now you want to make sure you sprinkle in nice and slow. And the consistency we're going to go for is about that of a milkshake. As you notice, as I keep pouring it in, you'll see it slowly sink down in the water. Now what you're looking for is when the water no longer starts to absorb the plaster quickly. Now, as you notice, it's taking longer and longer for it to soak in that plaster, right? So that means we're almost there. See, it almost did not soak that up, so we're almost there. We're seeing a little more. That means we're probably right on the money right there. So if it takes longer, about 5 or 6 seconds, like that right there is, that means you're probably golden. So what we're going to do is we're just going to hold the cup, and we're going to mix it in. Now it's still fairly watery, so we can mix a little bit more plaster in. And you notice now, when we pour it in there, almost nothing sinks down, right? So that means we're just about perfect on our consistency. So once you get a feel of it, you're going to be able to feel with your fingers and when the mixing stick just how well your plaster itself is mixed. As you notice, it's still running off fairly well. So I'm going to add just a little more. I like my plaster a little bit on the thick side. There we go. Let's go ahead and mix that in again. There we go. I can actually feel it. I wish you guys could feel this remotely, but sadly you can't really tell that in the video. As you notice, it doesn't come off quite as easily now. Now I could add a little bit more if I wanted to get it really, really, really thick. But for a mold like this, this mold has a good bit of detail, so a little bit thinner plaster is not going to hurt you. Once you get used to the casting, you'll be able to tell by the mold itself and by just the feel of the plaster when you have it just right. So all we're going to do is we're just going to gently pour plaster in there. Now, depending on your mold itself, some molds you may need to take like a little stick and kind of, or even a toothpick, and just kind of gently move it around in case there's some hard to reach areas. A nice simple flat mold like this is fairly easy to cast, so we don't have a lot to worry about there. As we gently, pour the plaster in there. All right. Now there is a couple different ways you can actually go about scraping your excess plaster off. Some people like to use like a little, what's called a little vibrating table that actually vibrates the air bubbles out. For something simple like this, you can actually just take your scraper and just want to gently tap. Actually, I'm going to move this out of the way just so I make sure I don't knock it over, because I am sometimes clumsy. So once again, we're just going to gently tap, and then what we're going to do is we're going to gently scrape it. Ideally, you don't want to scrape more than about 4 or 5 times at most. So you don't want to overwork it. So we're just going to tap it down one more time. Oops. You don't want to be moving your things all over. And 2 more, and that is it. Now, ideally, you want to have the least amount of waste possible. That way you're not wasting money, obviously. But that is it. All we're going to do is we're just going to let this dry. Depending on your plaster, Hydrostone takes about 10-15 minutes or so to fully cure and to fully harden to where you can pop them out. I actually already have one that's already been done right here. So let me go ahead and zoom out for a second. And this is one my 7-year-old daughter actually helped me cast. So we're going to go ahead and pop those out. Now, once you pop them out of the mold, now you're going to feel still a little cold and a little moist to the touch, which that's perfectly okay. And then what you want to do is you want to let your pieces dry for about 24 hours to 48 hours until they no longer feel cold to the touch. Now, when plaster is still undergoing the exothermic effect where it's releasing heat, it's actually going to feel a little cold because it's actually pulling in that air into the piece itself. So what you're going to do is you're just going to leave it until it no longer feels that wet or that cold, and that's when you know the curing has been completely done. And you always want to be careful, of course, because you're going to leave little pieces of mess all over the place. So you definitely want to make sure you don't have a big giant mess when you're done. There is one thing you can also do to help speed things up, and that is if you have a drying rack. This is actually one for a dehydrator. So I like to dehydrate my pieces. I just basically put it on this rack, put it on the dehydrator for an hour or two, and then instead of waiting a day or two, my pieces are ready to be glued and painted within about 2 hours. So if you do have a little dehydrator and you have an extra tray, it's a very, very good investment if you're going to do a lot of casting. But that is it, guys. That is the key to basically plaster casting. So stay tuned. I'm going to have some updated videos coming soon on little tips and trips. I said tricks and tips. I meant tips and tricks. Can't talk today. How to dye your plaster in case you want to have it pre-dyed. And then we're also going to go over how to do water effects, since that has been a big video. People have been asking me a lot lately on how to do specialized water effects. So that is how you go from plaster of Paris and water to actual cast items. So thanks for watching, guys, and stay tuned for some more updated videos. Bye-bye.